Someone bring me a drink. The water. Bring me wine.
Your King's Guard, Clegane. We must beat them back or they're going to take this city. Your King's city.
The King's Guard. The city. The King.
Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing a team I've always had a soft spot for, the Sacramento Kings. They really made a push for the play-in this season, but it ended up just not happening for them. So what's the roadmap for them moving forward? If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. Death, taxes, and the Sacramento Kings finishing below 500. And for those counting at home, that makes 16, count it, 16 consecutive losing seasons. That's an NBA record. And obviously with that, 16 consecutive years without a playoff appearance, but that probably goes without saying. And forget the least competently run franchise in the NBA. The Kings are making a real case here for the least competently run franchise in professional sports. Even teams like the Cleveland Browns and the Jacksonville Jaguars have had some recent success, very recent success in some cases. And I don't know much about hockey or baseball, so if there's some especially poorly run teams there, I may not know, so I'll have to take your word for it there. I have to imagine there are, just because there seem to be in every sport these just bottom-feeding teams that can never get out of their own way. But as far as the NBA teams go, who else would be in the running for this least competent award? I guess there's the Timberwolves here. They actually have made the playoffs 10 times in 33 seasons. And while that's not great, I think it feels like they've made the playoffs a lot less than 10 times. Among those 10 appearances, there's only been one trip to the conference finals, the rest for first round exits. So that's not great. There's also the Charlotte Bobcats / this current version of the Hornets. I'm still not entirely sure how that works because the Pelicans used to be in Charlotte. They relocated and became the New Orleans Hornets, but they were formerly the Charlotte Hornets. So I don't know if this current Charlotte Hornets franchise gets credit for the previous Charlotte Hornets franchise accomplishments, who are now the Pelicans, but I didn't count it for the sake of this argument. So this franchise started in the 04-05 season, and since then they've actually only made the playoffs 3 times. It was all first round exits. That also includes a 7-59 season, so they have a really strong case for that too. The Kings have played 37 seasons so far as the Sacramento Kings and have only made the playoffs 10 times. That does include a conference finals appearance and a couple of conference semifinals appearances. But in the defense of the Timberwolves and the Bobcats / current Hornets, those were brand new franchises being started completely from scratch. So it takes a few years to kind of get things going. So it's expected that you're going to miss the playoffs in at least the first 5 seasons, I would say. The Kings don't have that excuse. This is a franchise that's been around for 74 years, basically as long as the NBA has been in existence. And the Kansas City Kings, that's where the Kings were before they moved to Sacramento, they had made the playoffs fairly frequently and fairly recently. So it's not as if Sacramento inherited a franchise with no momentum. Even if you don't agree that the Kings are the most incompetently run franchise in the league, it would be hard to argue that the current general direction of the franchise is nearly as positive as what the Hornets and the Timberwolves have going. For the Timberwolves, they're currently in the playoffs, and despite 2 just giant collapses in one game, they were still at the very least able to win 1 game in the playoffs. I'm recording this pretty early on Saturday, so I don't know the results of the game tonight. And just in general, they also have a really young and exciting team headlined by who I think is a future superstar in this league, Anthony Edwards. And for the Hornets, they also have a roster full of young, exciting players, and that includes second-year All-Star point guard LaMelo Ball. Both of those franchises, the Timberwolves and the Hornets, have made huge strides forward in the last few seasons, and that's what gets me to the Kings. The Kings have been this middling lottery team for what feels like an eternity, never really bottoming out, but also never making the playoffs. And that's the worst place you can be as an NBA franchise, and the Kings have no one to blame for that but themselves. They're just constantly and consistently making just astonishing decisions across the board, whether that be in the draft, trades, free agency, player development, or even just the coaching staff. Draft wise, when they had arguably the best center in the league at the time, DeMarcus Cousins, he was just desperate to get any semblance of help, having not played with a single other all-star player in his entire career with the Kings. The Kings decide to trade down from the 8th pick to the 13th pick and draft a projected second round to undrafted player in Giorgio Papagiannis, who happened to play the same position as DeMarcus Cousins. Maybe they could have traded up and gone with Jamal Murray, who went 7th, or at the very least, they could have drafted a player who's currently on the roster in Domantas Sabonis, but more on him later. We also have this really fun Jimmer Fredette over Klay Thompson and Kawhi Leonard draft. And I'm not going to bury them too much on the Kawhi Leonard thing. No one foresaw him becoming the player that he is today. So I don't know. It's still hard to justify that Jimmer pick. There were a lot of question marks surrounding him. So when that pick didn't work out, it really wasn't a huge shock to many people that kind of were following that draft. There's also Ben McLemore over Giannis, but like Kawhi, it's kind of hard to blame the Kings for not foreseeing the type of player that Giannis was going to become. Who could have guessed that he was going to sprout up like 3 inches and basically become like this weird version of Shaq? It wasn't anything anyone saw in the cards. Most people were comparing him to like Paul George at the time. So not going to bury them too much for that. But there was a Thomas Robinson getting selected the pick before Damian Lillard. That one really hurts. And, oh, yeah, my personal favorite, taking Marvin Bagley over Luka Doncic because allegedly the GM Vlade Divac had some type of grudge against Luka's dad from back in their playing days. And grudge aside, the two picks after Luka were Jaren Jackson and Trae Young. So they did about as poorly as they could have there. Trade-wise, we also have some really fun trades here. 2015, the Kings sent Jason Thompson, Carl Landry, and Nick Stauskas to the 76ers with a 2017 first-round pick swap and a 2019 unprotected first for what was essentially just a salary cap dump. And what did those picks end up becoming? Well, that pick swap forced the Kings to move from the 3rd pick in the 2017 draft to the 5th pick, which meant De'Aaron Fox instead of Jason Tatum. So that really sucks. That 2019 pick ended up becoming the 14th pick, which was Romeo Langford. So no huge loss here, at least on the surface. But Matisse Thybulle was selected in that range. Later on, Jordan Poole and Kevin Porter Jr. Poole could have been a really huge add, but it would have been a reach at the time to take him that high. And also, a lot of his success this season can be attributed to that Warriors development program. He's really grown a lot as a player in the past few years. I think it's also worth mentioning that it was either the 13th or the 14th pick that was decided on a coin flip. The Heat win the toss and pick Tyler Hero 13th. So maybe it goes differently if the Kings are involved. Probably not, but so at best, that salary cap dump trade cost you Jason Tatum and a chance at Matisse Thybulle, and at worst, it cost you Jason Tatum and Tyler Hero. That's pretty rough. And what did the Kings end up doing with that cap room that they added? Well, they signed Rajon Rondo, Marco Bellinelli, and Costa Koufos. So yikes there. How about trading a future All-Star and top 5 finisher in MVP voting for nothing? Well, the Kings accomplished that just a year prior to that last trade I mentioned, when in 2014, they shipped off Isaiah Thomas for a $7 million trade exception. That's pretty rough. Free agency wise, I have no idea what they're doing most of the time. So just a couple of lowlights here. Dwayne Dedman, the current Miami Heat backup center, who's on a minimum contract. Well, the Kings entering the 2020 season decided to back up the Brinks truck for him for reasons that remain unclear to me today. 3 years, $40 million for him. He loses his starting job after just 4 games with the team, and he ends up getting shipped back to Atlanta, where Dedman was before signing with the Kings. But they had to attach 2 second-round picks with him just to get him out the door. He only ends up playing 34 games in a Kings uniform. There's also the summer of 2017 where the Kings kind of went a little crazy in free agency. They end up giving 3 years, $57 million to George Hill after drafting De'Aaron Fox with the number 5 pick. So a little confusing there. There's also 2 years, $24 million for Zach Randolph and 1 year, $8 million for Vince Carter. And listen, I'm all for these young teams getting some adults in the room, adding some vets who can kind of lead the locker room, but I'm just not sure a lucrative multi-year deal on a point guard after you draft a point guard is the way to go. I'm also just not sure that Zebo was ever going to be the mentoring type. And it's especially weird when George Hill, who was the biggest recipient of the backing up of the Brinks truck, he only ends up playing 43 games with the team. And after that first year, they send Zach Randolph home, where they obviously still have to pay him. So that's pretty rough. And that's not even getting into free agency decisions like letting restricted free agent Bogdan Bogdanovic go for nothing. They had a sign and trade set up with the Milwaukee Bucks, but there was some tampering or some issues where they decided to pull the trigger on that too soon. I don't know. Something weird happened. It's the Kings, so of course something weird happened. But why couldn't they find like or work out a different sign and trade? Like why they're like, well, they just throw up their hands like, well, we didn't get that sign and trade, so whatever, we'll just let him walk. And honestly, they really should have just kept him though. Like I think he's one of the most underrated players in the league. And it's especially weird because they end up wanting to ship off Buddy Hield anyway. So they kind of decide that they're going to go with Buddy Hield instead of Bogdan, which is weird in and of itself. But then like a couple months later, they're like, oh, we want out of Buddy Hield. So why not just keep Bogdan? I don't understand. In the player development category here, who is a player that has drastically improved during their time with the Kings in recent memory? It's basically DeMarcus Cousins, but how much credit can we really give the Kings for the development of Boogie Cousins? Like, look at somebody like Marvin Bagley. They just never created a role for him, and he's basically the same player he entered the league as. Same with Ben McLemore. McLemore had everything you would want in a potential NBA shooting guard. He was ultra athletic, had great shooting touch, and even if he never became a star in the league, it was really hard to imagine when he was drafted that he wouldn't at least be a major rotational piece for someone. But like Bagley, he just never really improved. The biggest example of their player development failings has to be Tyreke Evans. Tyreke had a historically great rookie year. He was in really rare company in terms of the numbers that he put up. 20 points, 5 assists, 5 rebounds. The only other rookies to do that at the time were Oscar Robertson, Michael Jordan, and LeBron James. And later on, Luka Doncic would join that club. He just looked like a superstar in the making. And that first year, he played point guard for the Kings. But after that rookie year, his role just became way less defined with the team. It just seemed year after year they were asking him to go from shooting guard to small forward, back to point guard, back to shooting guard. And as a result, he just never got better, which is such a shame. And I think that's the career that I'm going to be most mad at the Kings for just squandering. And their coaching issues just seem to kind of go hand in hand with the development issues. Adelman's last year with the Sacramento Kings was the 2006 season, where they get bounced in the first round of the playoffs, and they've not been back since. They've not even finished above 500 since then. And since that 2006 season, they've had 11 different coaches. 11. That's an insane number for 16 seasons of basketball to roll through 11 coaches. That's insane. And there are 2 major issues with this coaching carousel they have going on here. Number one, they just have unrealistic expectations for their coaches. And then number 2, they bring back coaches just to fire them a handful of games into the season. For the unrealistic expectations piece, there's obviously the Adelman spot. The team was trending in the wrong direction for years, and that fun C-Web group was either just out the door completely or they were starting to get old. So it was time for a reboot. That happens to every long-standing core on a team. So it's really hard to blame the coach for that, even though that's the one who typically gets blamed. So whatever, they move off of Rick Adelman. Moving on, Michael Malone, the current Denver coach, was 28-54 in his first year. He gets off to an 11-13 start, and they can him. And while 11-13 isn't exactly lighting the world on fire, it had been 7 seasons at that point since the Kings had won 30 games in a year. So that pace was a huge improvement from what we had seen for nearly a decade from them. The last one I want to mention is Dave Joerger. He takes over for George Karl. The first 2 seasons under Joerger were middling, bad, just kind of more of the same. But the 2019 year, they actually go 39-43. That is the best record they've had since Rick Adelman was let go. So what do? They fire him. Now, that was the summer that Vlade Divac took over. So he didn't hire him, so he felt no commitment to him. But still, that's bizarre to fire a coach after your best season in, I don't know, 15 years, 14 years. I just don't understand what the expectation was for any of those coaches that I just mentioned. Now, sure, they've had some bad coaches who deserve to be fired, but the 3 that I just mentioned, I don't know what the expectations were. And I understand that Adelman, Malone, Joerger, I understand they're not Phil Jackson. They aren't top level NBA coaches, but you're the Kings. You aren't in the running for the top guys, just like you aren't in the running for the top free agents. So I just feel like they've been firing guys without considering who they're going to be replacing them with. It's sort of like the current housing market. Sure, you could sell your house for a really high price nowadays, but you still have to turn around and buy a different house. There are tons of other home buyers out there who are also trying to get good houses. So you can either compete in a bidding war or you end up worse off and renting an apartment. I feel like time after time, the Kings sell their perfectly fine house or coach and end up renting an apartment coaching wise. If you do decide to fire a coach as a franchise, why do it within the first few games of the season? I'll just never understand that. If you fire the coach in the offseason, you can choose whatever candidate you want rather than having to promote a guy from the staff of the coach that you just fired. It ends up just wasting an entire season. I mentioned Michael Malone was fired after an 11-13 start. We also have Reggie Theus, who was brought back, fired 24 games into the season. The Kings actually had 3 different coaches that year that they fired Malone. They had Tyrone Corbin, who coached 28 games, and then George Karl takes over. The last one I want to mention is Paul Westphal, who was fired 7 games into a season. 7 games. And granted, he wasn't getting along with Boogie Cousins, but still, like, I'm sure that wasn't a sudden development that all of a sudden they aren't getting along. So, like, if they weren't getting along, why bring him back at all? And that gets me to this season for the Kings. This past year has pretty much been the embodiment of the long and tortured history of this franchise. Let's go in chronological order. Let's start with the draft. So the Kings entering the draft last year already have 2 point guards in De'Aaron Fox and Tyrese Halliburton, where it's really unclear entering the year how these two are going to fit together. So in the draft, the Kings take an undersized point guard in Davion Mitchell. So they now have 3 young point guards who obviously aren't going to be able to share the court at the same time. Now, in their defense, the other players selected after Davion Mitchell were like a 6'4" to 6'6" shooting guards who that was a player that they also didn't really need, but it still would have been a better fit than adding another point guard. So draft-wise, what wasn't a complete failure. I wouldn't call it a success either based on what was already on the team. In general, sure, a rebuilding team should go with the best player available. So I don't want to kill them too much for this, but it still seemed like not the guy you would want to go with. And for Davion, I actually like the improvement he's shown throughout the year, but I think the jury is still out on whether or not he's going to be a starter in this league. The rest of the offseason was mired in some bizarre moves that, while they weren't total disasters, I just don't know. I can't really say anything positive as far as what they did. They end up re-signing Rashawn Holmes, 4 years, 46 million. And I like Holmes, but at the time, even I just wasn't sure about giving him 4 years. Then you give around 2 years, 8 million for each of Alex Len, Mo Harkless, and Terrence Davis. I like Terrence Davis. I think he's solid, but if I never have to watch another Alex Len or Mo Harkless game, if I never have to watch them pick up a ball again, it will be too soon. The Len thing is kind of whatever for me since he was on a different team, but the Kings had Harkless in-house and still elected to re-sign him. I cannot imagine what they saw in him. There's also a 3-team trade where they turned in current thorn in my side, DeLon Wright, into Tristan Thompson. With a crowded backcourt, I can understand why they would want to ship DeLon Wright out, but Tristan Thompson isn't the guy that I would have had my eye on, to say the least. The start of the season is where things really start to get wild. After just 17 games, the Kings fired head coach Luke Walton. And fans were kind of clamoring for Walton's head on a pike after last season. So again, either commit to him for an entire season unless he pulls some John Gruden or something and just goes nuts, or let him go in the offseason. If he was on that hot of a seat, why bring him back at all? I just don't understand it. So Alvin Gentry ends up taking over, and to the shock of no one, nothing really changes. Heading into the deadline, it felt like everyone except for the Kings front office thought it was time to kind of hit the reset button and build around Tyrese Halliburton. But the Kings front office decided to go against a rebuild from their current rebuild and pushed all the chips in to acquire Indiana Pacers center Domantas Sabonis. Deal ends up being Domantas Sabonis, Justin Holiday, Jeremy Lamb, and a 2023 second-round pick for Halliburton, Buddy Hield, and Tristan Thompson. And sure, Kings got out of there without giving up any first-round picks, which is like gold when it's the Sacramento Kings. They get out of the Buddy Hield contract, and Sabonis is only going to be 26 next year, and he's on an affordable deal. Great. They also add some quality wing players in Justin Holiday and Jeremy Lamb, but kind of this is where things start to unravel a little bit. Jeremy Lamb is a free agent this offseason, Justin Holiday the next, and Sabonis the year after that. So 2 years from now, when Sabonis is a free agent, is he going to re-sign for this mess? Maybe, maybe not. If he does want to re-sign, what type of contract is he wanting? What type of money is he wanting? It's likely going to be a max. And where are you going as a team with De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis as 2 max contract players? Hopefully to a play-in, but there's just no chance you're making out of the first round with Sabonis and Fox as your best players. So I just don't understand what the point was. And as far as the Buddy Hield contract goes, I think this being stated as a bad contract is just way overblown. It's a front-loaded deal. It only has 2 years left on it. So while it's not a great contract, sure, people act like it's John Wall's deal or Russell Westbrook, and it's just not that bad. For what they gave up, Halliburton looks like he can be a really special player in this league, like multiple year all-star, maybe even all NBA type special. And he was a guy that seemed committed to sticking around for the long term and trying to turn around this franchise. That just isn't a guarantee in the guy that you brought in Sabonis. It's just not guaranteed that he's going to want to stick around for this. Who's to say that next season he's like, thanks, but no thanks. This isn't for me, and ask for a trade. Or he could just walk once his contract is up. And for me, Sabonis just can't be your best player if you want to be a really good team. And that's not to say that I don't like Sabonis. I really like Sabonis and I really like Fox, but they just aren't face of the franchise type guys. For me, Sabonis is the tie it all together guy. A team looking to make a trade for him should have viewed that as it being the final piece of the puzzle, not the first piece. He should have been traded to a team where they were like, yeah, we like what we have here, but we need that final guy to put us over the top. I get that the backcourt was too crowded with a ton of point guards, but Halliburton was the last guy of that point guard group I would have wanted to move. It also seems like they overpaid for Sabonis. Indiana had publicly stated that they wanted either a first and a young player or two firsts. At that stage, Sabonis had received very little trade interest, so I think they could have gotten out of there with Davion Mitchell as the center of the trade rather than Halliburton. Even if I had to give up a protected first-round pick, I would have much rather done that than give up Halliburton. As far as the backcourt goes, I really do think that a Fox and Halliburton backcourt could have worked, but the only way it would have worked is if Fox had agreed to get off the ball more and the keys had kind of been handed over to Halliburton. If Fox was unwilling to do that, unwilling to play off the ball, for me, I would have just played out the year and shopped Fox in the offseason, looking to build around Halliburton. So there you have it. All in 1 year. Weird trades, weird free agency decisions, weird coaching decisions. This Kings season really just had it all in terms of what we have come to expect from the Kings. And in the other eulogies I've done so far, I've laid out the roadmap to get the team back on track. It's either been a case of the team needing to continue to rebuild, or in the Lakers case, it's clear that the right direction for them is to kind of push for a title. The way I view this Kings team and the way they view themselves, or the goals that they seem to be striving for, just really don't align. My views for them versus their own views, just they're not matching up. So it's hard for me to make a roadmap for that, because I would say, like, yeah, we probably need to be rebuilding here. We don't really have anything that is going to carry us forward into the future, but I'm going to try to honor their wishes here. So in a situation that I'm forced to turn this roster into a competitor, this is kind of how I would do it. So let's start by kind of looking at the core, which is really just De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis at this point. And for the Sabonis part of it, he's kind of just this poor man's Jokic. But while he's a good passer, he really isn't the transcendent passer that Jokic is. I think his playmaking is more along the lines of the level of a Bam Adebayo, but obviously you're not getting any of the defensive stuff that you get with Bam, but you get a lot more on offense. And as far as how you can use Bam and Sabonis, you can run them very similarly. You can run Sabonis very similarly to what the Heat do with Bam in terms of using them as a fulcrum or hub of the offense. And they even work out of similar spots on the floor. Scoring wise, I mentioned with Sabonis, he's a much better scorer than Bam is. He has some shooting touch, but he's really best suited for operating out of the posts, either the high or the low post. You would really be misusing him if you expect him to just be the stretch 4/stretch 5. And out of those post touches, he really has some impressive footwork and ability to finish either inside, or, as I mentioned, he's a pretty special passer. The apple definitely didn't fall very far from the tree in this case. So if I were designing a game plan here, designing an offense, I would definitely want to use him as the hub of the offense and kind of just spread the floor around him as much as possible for those post touches, and run guards like De'Aaron Fox off some handoff action with Sabonis with the ball. And I think for this Kings thing to be successful, Sabonis is likely going to have to be the leading assist man for the team next season. De'Aaron Fox, I'm not married to keeping him long-term here, but I think it would be a big mistake if they tried to flip him this offseason. He had a pretty down year this season, so there likely aren't going to be very many trade suitors for him, or he's going to have such a diminished value that it's just not worth trading him. So I would take this season as more of an evaluation year for his fit besides Sabonis. Either things are working out well and the Kings are fighting for a play-in spot, and thus you would likely want to keep De'Aaron Fox, or things aren't going well and you're out of play-in contention. In the case that this pairing with Sabonis doesn't work, I would just shut Sabonis down the stretch of the season and run everything through Fox down the stretch to try to prop him up and increase his trade value entering the offseason. As far as how they should use Fox, I mentioned them running him off some handoffs, and just generally, I think getting him off the ball more is going to be key. I think there has also been just some misunderstanding on the part of the Kings as to who he is as a player. They seem to want to run him off of a million pick and rolls like he's Chris Paul, but he just isn't ever going to be that. He isn't a very effective perimeter shooter, and he's not as good of a playmaker as what would be required for him to be a true floor general. I just don't view him as a true point guard, but he does have one tool in the toolbox that almost no one else has, and it can't be taught. It's speed. De'Aaron Fox is likely the fastest player in the league, and the Kings just haven't really done enough to weaponize that. It could be a really special weapon for them if they find a way to use it correctly. A little bit like Curry's shooting, just obviously in a much different way. And with Curry, sure, he could have been good as a traditional point guard, just running a bunch of pick and rolls and being on the ball all the time, but he really became dangerous when the team committed to him playing off the ball. It's really what weaponized his shooting into something that you could build an offense around. And defensively, it's something you constantly have to be mindful of as an entire unit. And it just opens up the floor for all of his teammates. I think De'Aaron Fox's speed could be used off the ball very similarly to the Curry three-point shot. Sure, it won't be as effective, but if you use it right, it could really open up the floor for the rest of his teammates. Just one scenario here. Just imagine Sabonis is at the left elbow and De'Aaron Fox is sprinting from the right to the left to receive the handoff from him. Whoever is guarding him isn't likely able to keep up. So if they're behind, Fox receives the ball and it's going to force the big to help off. Fox, with a full head of steam going downhill against a big guy, he has no chance of doing anything except fouling him. So that's going to force that big guy into potentially either overcommitting or anticipating Fox receiving that handoff. And that's where this just will turn into a pick and roll. He can either dump it to Sabonis, or Sabonis can fake the handoff, do like a little spin and drive to the hoop. Just in general, I think creating scenarios where Fox has momentum and is asked to just score and make quick decisions would be really great, rather than having him try to orchestrate the entire offense. There was one player historically that is very similar to De'Aaron Fox, too small to be a true shooting guard, but not enough of a perimeter playmaker to be a point guard. Not a great shooter, but lightning quick. And it's one of my favorite players of all time, Monte Ellis. If the Kings or De'Aaron Fox look to kind of build a role and kind of model his game after what Ellis did, I think that's going to be the best way to use him. Sure, Ellis spent a ton of time with the ball, but he was definitely more of a shooting guard in terms of how he was used than a point guard. He was lethal on the fast break and really effective in the half court, not as a ball dominant guy, but as a guy who could catch the swing pass and just immediately attack, or run a pick and roll from the wing, or ISO at the end of the clock. And Ellis was out of the league far earlier than anyone expected him to be, but it was more due to a shift in the league and a couple of problems with Ellis that hopefully aren't going to apply to Fox. Ellis was ousted during a time where the league was kind of moving towards analytics, so teams just weren't willing to sign up for an inefficient, high-volume shooting, undersized shooting guard. Today, the NBA has gotten a lot smaller across the board, and Fox isn't really a selfish scorer like Ellis was. And frankly, it just seems like Fox is a great teammate, not selfish at all. So this role should work even better for Fox than it did for Ellis. Looking ahead to the offseason, as far as the Kings' potential free agents and decisions they have to make, they have Dante DiVincenzo. He's a restricted free agent. Jeremy Lamb, unrestricted. Josh Jackson, Damian Jones, also unrestricted. And they have Trey Lyles on a team option. And I got to be honest, this unrestricted free agency group, I really don't feel strongly one way or another about anyone here. Jeremy Lamb is fine, but I think with Justin Holiday, Terrence Davis, and if you're presumably bringing back DiVincenzo, I'm just not sure he's really all that needed here. Josh Jackson on a minimum contract with no expectations to play. Sure, fine, whatever. Bring him back. It doesn't really matter. Damian Jones, I actually kind of like off the bench. He's a really high energy guy in the games that I've seen him play in. But I guess if you already have Len and Sabonis and Rashawn Holmes all fighting for the center minutes, I guess don't bring him back. I don't know. Don't. It doesn't really matter. He is better just flat out better than Alex Len. So I think just on the basis of that, I'd be willing to fight to keep him a little bit. And for the Damian Jones piece, there was a time this season where Holmes was hurt and Alvin Gentry was early into his coaching tenure. He was trying to find just anything at center, be it Tristan Thompson, Alex Land, Damian Jones, maybe even Marvin Bagley here and there. And it was just really clear that Jones was the best option. It became very clear very quickly. As far as Trey Lyles goes, it's a $2.6 million team option. So that's a no-brainer. Bring him back. He's a really solid player. That just seems like an absolute slam dunk for them to bring back. That leaves Dante DiVincenzo, and I'm not married to keeping him based on some of the rumors I've heard. I think the highest I would feel comfortable paying him is like $10 million a year, but I would really feel way more comfortable around the $8 million mark. But I've heard he might get 15 a year from somebody, and if that's going to be the case, I'm letting him go. He's a fine enough player, but the Kings are already in the weeds a bit here cap-wise. And I'm just not sure that keeping him or getting rid of him is really going to change things for them. And, you know, if you're talking about 4 years, $60 million, that type of deal, it's just not worth it to me. Also, you know, just in general, the 6'5" streaky shooting guard is probably the easiest spot to fill in the NBA. So I think they could, even if they don't get a player as good as DiVincenzo, I think whoever they get could do a decent impression of him on a much lesser contract. And I'm not saying they should let him walk for nothing. There's really no need to repeat the Bogdan thing all over again. So if they're not wanting to pay him $15 million a year, you know, I think it should be a case where they try to work out some type of sign and trade just to bring some type of assets back, something back. After all, they did give up a former number 2 overall pick on his rookie deal to get DiVincenzo. Looking at the current roster here, Harrison Barnes is a keep for me unless they get some Godfather offer for him. I don't see that happening. And for Harrison Barnes, he's a versatile defender, a decent shooter. He doesn't need the ball a lot for his scoring opportunities. So he's going to be great for that stretch 4 role, especially, you know, alongside Sabonis, where Sabonis is either going to throw him passes out on the perimeter for kickouts for threes, or Barnes is athletic enough that, you know, off of a cut, he's going to be able to finish near the hoop. And Richaun Holmes is really the only other guy on the team that might have a decent amount of trade value. And I think they absolutely need to shop him. As I've said, I like Richaun Holmes, but I just don't like the fit alongside Sabonis. Sabonis really struggled to kind of make it work with Miles Turner in Indiana, despite Turner being a really capable three-point shooter. Holmes is a decent rebounder, sure, okay, shot blocker, yeah, but not a shooter at all. And there are going to be some teams this offseason that are going to be in the market to make an upgrade at center. So Charlotte is the first team that comes to mind for that. So I think you could do some type of Richaun Holmes, Kelly Oubre swap just so that the Kings can add back a decent sized wing. The Hornets have a lot of depth at the wing position, so they might really be wanting to upgrade at center there. The math isn't quite there on a 1-for-1 swap, but it's close enough that it shouldn't be too hard to make that work. I don't think you're going to get much for Richaun Holmes, but if you can add a bigger wing rotational piece, I think that would be worth it to move off of him. Draft-wise, the Kings are likely falling into that 5 to 10 range, which isn't actually that bad for them. They absolutely don't need a point guard or a small shooting guard, and this draft seems to have tons of good wing depth in that pick range. I think a traditional center like Jalen Duren should be just completely off the board for them, but in the case that they do sneak into the top 3, either Jabari Smith or Chet Holmgren are good fits here. I think there's just too much duplication of playmaking with Banchero, and it just feels like to me that he and Sabonis would just get in each other's way too often. Jabari Smith, not a guy who needs the ball a lot in terms of dribbling the air out of it, and he could make some cuts to the basket, and he's a lethal three-point shooter, so he would make a great target for Domantas Sabonis. Chet Holmgren, for me, is the ideal fit of the top 3 for the Kings. Sabonis is not a good defensive player, and he doesn't play well alongside any other centers, so it makes him kind of a weird player to build a team around because He can't protect the rim, but you also can't add a center who can do that for him just because he doesn't play well offensively with them. And that kind of gets me to Chet. He kind of perfectly fits alongside Sabonis. Offensively, Chet really doesn't want to post up a lot. He plays way more on the perimeter like a guard. And then on the defensive end, he adds that defensive anchor, that rim protecting piece that Sabonis lacks. Also, Chet is used to playing alongside a dominant post player from his time at Gonzaga with Drew Timme. So it should be a seamless transition for him should the Kings luck out and get into the top three. But if I'm being honest, I really hope this doesn't happen. The Kings don't exactly have the best track record in terms of developing guys. And Chet Holmgren is someone that's going to need a lot of development. So for his sake, I'm hoping that he can avoid the Kings. Free agency wise, this is not a particularly strong class this year in terms of the things that the Kings are going to want to add. And they just frankly don't have a lot of cap room at around 13 million-ish should they decide to let everyone walk. So it's not like they're going to make any really franchise altering moves here this offseason free agency wise, at least with the way things are kind of currently set up for them. And for them, I think big guys and players that need the ball a lot should be off the table for them. Needing the ball wise, they already have Davion Mitchell, De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis, and then Barnes can also fill in spots for that shot creation piece. Until I see what Davion Mitchell can do and how Fox and Sabonis work together, I don't want to take away any of those guys' touches. If you're getting somebody like Zach LaVine, that's one thing, but he isn't going to be in their price range. So somebody like Dennis Schroeder, who would be in their price range, I just don't want more mouths to feed in terms of score first guards. Bigs wise, unless you're unloading both Alex Len and Rashawn Holmes, I just don't see a case for adding another center here. Even then, even if they do ship those two off, I think Damian Jones can hold it down well enough as the backup center. I guess if they were going to grab anyone, I'd take a flyer on Mo Bamba just because he can shoot the three. It doesn't seem like he has a post game, so you can just have him kind of stand out on the perimeter. But I think that the Magic are likely going to be able to match any offer that I would be comfortable with offering as the Kings. I think they really need to focus what little money they have on adding some big wings, adding some bigger wings. They could potentially get a guy like TJ Warren on a discount just because of the injuries, but that's pretty risky just because of the injury history with him. Otto Porter Jr. is a guy I've been recommending to multiple teams, and I think he would be a really good pickup here. You've got somebody like maybe Cody Martin from the Hornets. Well, not a super big wing. I still think he adds enough defensively and athletically that he could really help you out. If you're just wanting to take some cheap flyers on some guys, you could go with Kevin Knox, Markieff Morris, somebody like that. And then also a backup combo guard might be helpful here. Someone who can play off the ball when De'Aaron Fox and Davion Mitchell are in, but also can play point if you're missing one of those guys due to injury or just giving them the night off. Maybe someone like Ricky Rubio, although he's likely either going to a contender or is going to want more money than you're able to offer. Trey Burke also might not be a bad pickup. He's a guy with some point guard experience, but he's transitioned to more of an off-ball role here with the Mavs. And while he isn't a destiny changer, he might be worth a look as a low-cost player you could use in the case that your guards are healthy or even in the case that they aren't. Just in general, they really just need to round out the fringes of this roster with real NBA players. Guys like Mo Harkless, Alex Len shouldn't even be sniffing the court unless we have another COVID outbreak. At the end of the day, the Kings just pushed the chips in here way too early. They cashed in their potential face of the franchise, and they're still going to be on the outside looking in terms of the playoffs moving forward as things are currently constructed. I'm all for trying to be competitive after several years of tanking, but that means rounding the roster out on the edges with some quality vets, not cashing in your best young player for a marginal upgrade. The Kings, over the years, no matter who has been coaching, playing, or managing, have been an outright disaster, and that isn't likely going to change unless ownership changes hands.